Hey everyone, welcome to this live session. We are running a Python marathon today, and the topic is loops and conditional statements in Python. We are covering this topic in a series of 4 videos. We have already covered Python if-else statements and also the while loop statement in the previous live sessions. This is the last live session of the series in which we cover the for loop in Python. In this live session, Anjali, the subject matter expert, will take you through the for loop statement in Python, and she will help you understand the concept with the help of small Python scripts as well. So without further ado, let's get started.
A warm welcome to all our viewers. This is Anjali from Simplilearn. So in our previous video, we went through what loops in Python are. Today we'll focus solely on for loop. So let's start from scratch and look at what exactly for loop is. So for loop is used to iterate over a sequence. Now this sequence could be a list, tuple, array, string, or even a range of numbers. So if you have multiple elements stored consecutively, for loop is exactly what you need to access each of those elements. Now here is the syntax for loop. So first you have the keyword for followed by counter. Counter is just a variable which keeps track of the position of the element that you're accessing right now. And then you have the keyword in followed by sequence. Now sequence is basically the name of your list, your tuple, array, string, or even a range of integers. And then it's followed by colons. And in the very next line, you can put down your statements which come within the for loop. So to better understand this, we have a series of demos which I'll be showing on PyCharm. So let's move on to that. So our first demo is a classic example of where you use for loop. That is to access the elements of a list. So first we'll create our list. I'll name my list X and we'll have the elements 1, 4.2 and the string Simplilearn. Now this particular list of ours has just 3 elements. So we could print the elements specifying their positions individually. Say X, 0, X, 1 and X of 2. So we could print the elements of our list specifying the indexes individually. So say X of 0, X of 1, X of 2. And if we run this code, save this and run it. As you see here, all the elements are printed correct. But what if our list had 100 elements? This would be quite a tedious approach then, wouldn't it? So here is where you use the for loop. With for, you can have a counter variable, which is I in my case, in, and this is the place where you enter your list name. So X, colon, and I'll just say print of I. So what we are doing here is we have this variable I, which is a counter, and it will iterate over every element of X. So the first iteration, I will hold the value 1. The second iteration, I will hold the value 4.2 and the third, it will hold the value Simplilearn. So let's run this code. And there you go. All our elements are printed. So this is a much simpler way to print the elements of your list. Now for can also be used to print every character in your string separately. So if X is just equal to Simplilearn, and we run this code once again, you see all the elements of your string are printed. Now if you want all of them to be printed together, that is in one line, in your print statement, just put end equal to braces and then run this code. And your entire string is printed here, but character by character. So we can debug this to see how it's printed. Just place a breaking point on your first line and debug sample. And I'll enlarge my console. Press F8 to move from one line to the other. And our first line is executed. So X holds the value Simplilearn. And now we are on our for loop line. The first time we execute it, I takes the value of the very first character in our string X, which is S. So now when we say print of I, S gets printed. We go back to our console, we can see this here. And next time we press F8, now I will take the value I from X and I gets printed. In this manner, all the characters of your string are printed one by one. And then your program terminates. So that's the very basic example of how you can use for loop. Now let's try another case where we want to print all the even numbers in the range of 0 to 20. So once again, we have for I, which is our counter variable, in. Now when you want to specify a range of values, you use the function range and give your starting value and your ending value. So the thing with range is, guys, that if you keep your ending value as 20, it will only consider the numbers from 0 to 19. But we want 20 also to be included. So our ending value is 21 here. Put your colons. And let's just see what this prints first. So print of I, and we'll run this code. So here the for loop printed all the values from 0 up till 20. Now we want only the even values between 0 to 20 to be printed. One way of doing this is that you can check using an if statement if every value that is stored in I is a multiple of 2. Or you can simply modify this range function slightly and put comma 2. So here what this means is that every second element is only printed. So 0 will be printed, 1 would be skipped, and then 2 would be printed. Let's see that. Run it. So as you see here, in just 2 lines of code, we got all our even numbers between 0 to 20 printed. Now say we want to find the sum of all these even numbers. But this time, because we want to use a slightly different approach, we'll use the if statement to know if the value in I is even or not. So the first line would be about the same except you delete the 2 from the range. And then you have if statement. So if I mod 2 is equal to 0, you will have a variable say sum, which is equal to sum plus I. So what we're doing here is I will hold a value between 0 to 21, and then this value is tested to check if it is a multiple of 2. That is, if division by 2 gives any remainder or not in the if statement. And if it does not give any remainder, that is, if the remainder is 0, then we come in and we keep adding this I to another variable, which in our case is sum. So sum is the addition of all the even numbers. Now we have not declared sum as yet, and sum needs to have some initial value. So just outside your for loop, put sum equal to 0. So here we have added all our even numbers. Now once this entire procedure is done, we can print a variable sum. Let's run this code, and the sum of all the even numbers between 0 to 20 is 110. Now let's move on to our next demo where we'll be printing patterns. So patterns are a great way to implement for loops and also to sharpen your programming skills. In a previous video, we had a pattern with asterisk symbols. We printed an inverted triangle using asterisks. So here, this is the pattern we'll be printing with numbers. So for this particular program, we'll be taking input from the user specifying a number. So in this example, the number entered by the user would be 5. And as you can see, the number given by the user is the last digit of the last row. Also, it is the number of rows in the pattern. So let's begin coding this. First, we'll take the input from the user in a variable, say n. So all the inputs given by the users always in string format. In case of Python, we need to convert this into int. So input, enter a number. Now we'll have the first for loop, which is for every row. So for I in range of 1 to n plus 1, because if we give n, then the range will be taken only from n to n minus 1. Now that's an outer for loop. And in case of patterns, as you go through others, you'll notice that there are at least 2 for loops even for the most simple patterns. So here is where we implement nested loops, specifically nested for loops. Now the outer for loop, as I mentioned earlier, is for the number of rows. And we'll have the inner for loop for every element in the row. For j in range of, again, 1 up till I. So when we consider our outer for loop, it goes from 1, then 2, 3, 4, and then 5. And the inner for loop prints from 1 up till the ith number. Now inside our inner for loop, we'll just print j. And we do not want to go to the next line immediately after printing j. So put end equal to quotes. But once we complete printing the entire row, then we want to move on to the next line. So after our inner for loop, that is under our outer for loop, we'll print the new line. So just put a plain print statement here. Now let's run this code. Enter a number. We'll start with 5. And as you can see here, 1, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4 has been printed. But the fifth row is not printed yet. So if you go back to your code, you'll see where the error is. It's in the second for loop. We have run it from 1 to I and not I plus 1. So what happened here is that since we ran it till I, when I was 1, the inner for loop ran 0 number of times. And therefore, it's the first row that was not printed. And our second row printed just 1. Our third row printed just 1, 2, and so on. So we'll make this correction and run it again. Enter 5. And there you go. Our pattern is printed. Let's run it again and try a different number this time. Say 10. So our pattern is printed for any number that you enter. Now another very popular application of nested for loops is accessing the elements of a matrix. So here we'll implement matrix as a list containing lists. And what we'll do is we'll take 2 such lists or 2 such matrices from the user and we'll find their sum. So to add 2 matrices, it's very important that they have the same dimensions. That is, they have the same number of rows and columns. So we'll take the number of rows and columns from the user first. And convert this to int. Next, take the number of columns, my variable c. Now we'll create our list, our first list, which is x. Right now, x is empty. Okay, so our first for loop will be to iterate over the elements in our list x. So for I in R, because R is the number of elements in X and C is the number of elements in the list in X. So for I in R, and now our inner for loop. So our outer for loop are for the lists in X, that is for the elements in X, and our inner for loop will be for the elements within those lists in X. So for J in C. So the approach we'll be taking is that we'll first create those individual lists within X and then we'll add that list to X. So let's name our inside list as val, and to add elements to a list, use the function insert. Now the element would be inserted in the jth position and the value for the element would be again taken from the user. So input, enter the I into jth element. So we'll enter the placeholders to %d element I comma j. So we haven't declared val yet. Let's do that. It's initially an empty list. So all the values within our list val would be inserted within the inner for loop. So once we are out of the inner for loop, our list val would be ready. So now we can add this list val to our list x. So outside here, put x dot insert at position I, the insert val. I'll explain this part once again. So our outer for loop for I in R, where R is the number of elements in X, that is the number of lists within our parent list X, would be counted in I, and our inner for loop, which is for the elements within our child list, would be counted in J, and inside our inner for loop, we'll take the input from the user and insert it into our temporary list val, and then once we exited the inner for loop, we'll add this list val to our parent list X. And we are done with taking the input for the first list. Now in the similar manner, we'll take the input for the second list too. We'll name our second list Y, which is initially empty. And you can just copy paste this code here. Change the X to Y, and that should do it. Now one thing we missed out here is clearing val. We don't necessarily have to do this because every time you go back to the inner for loop and you say input this value at the jth position of val, the previous value will be automatically overwritten, but still we'll clear it every time we exit the inner for loop. Okay, so we are done with taking the input for both our lists containing lists, and now we move on to the part where we find their sum. So first we create a variable sum, which will be an empty list. Now this list will hold the added values from the other two lists. So again, for accessing the elements of a list containing lists, we need nested for loops. So for I in R once again, and for j in C. So just like when we took input, when we are finding the sum 2, we'll first add the elements of the child list. So say find the sum of the first list within X and the first list within Y. And once we find the sum of these two lists, we'll put that into our parent list sum. So we'll use val again for our temporary list, and val.insert at the jth position the sum of the elements in the jth position of our ith list in X and Y. So X of I, j plus Y of I, j. And once we come out of the inner for loop, that means our val list is complete. We can add this list to our parent list sum. So sum dot insert at the ith position, insert val. And every time we exit the inner for loop, we also clear val. And that's how you take two lists of lists from the user, find their sum, and finally print it. So just print sum. Let's run this code. Enter the number of rows. Let's start with 2. Number of columns 2. Okay, so we have an error here for I in R. So the error here is R is an integer, and when we want to iterate over a range of numbers, we need to specify the function range. So range of and the indices in lists or matrices start from 0. So 0 up to R. In the similar way, let's make this correction for all our for loops. 0 to C and here too. And here too. Okay, let's run the program once again. And now we got to enter our elements. So our first element, second, third, fourth element. So with that, we completed all the elements of our first list. 0th element is the first element in your first list of X. 1 is the second element in your first list. 1 0 is the first element in your second list, and 1 1 would be the second element in your second list, all in X. Now we start entering the elements for Y, the first element of the first list in Y. So we entered all the elements for both X and Y, and this is our list sum. But then this is not the sum of the elements. What has happened here is that it's just concatenated the elements of the two lists. So our first element in list X, that is 1, and our first element in list Y, which is 2, is just concatenated and it's given 12, whereas we want 3, the sum of them. This is because we took the input from the user, but we forgot to convert it to int. That means all the elements were stored in the list as strings, and when we use just the plus sign on strings, it just concatenates the values. So now we'll convert each of the inputs to integer. And there you go. Our inputs are now converted to integer. Now we can run the program once again. Enter the elements. And this time, our sum is printed right. So 1 plus 5 is 6, 2 plus 6 is 8, 3 plus 7, which is 10, and 4 plus 8 is 12. So now that you learn how to deal with matrices or lists containing lists using for loops, let's move on to strings. So our next demo would be to find out if the string entered by the user is a palindrome or not. So a palindrome is a word, a phrase, or even a sentence that even when read in the reverse direction is the same. So for example, madam is a palindrome because if you read madam in the reverse direction too, it still says madam. Similarly, the sentence was it a rat I saw is also a palindrome. So now let's write a program to figure out if the string entered by the user is a palindrome or not. First step, we take the input from the user, enter a string. We'll store this in our variable stg. Now if your string is a palindrome, that means the first element of your string is the same as the last element of your string. And the second element of your string would be the same as the second last element of your string, and so on. So if your string is madam, then as you see, M is your first element and M is your last element. A is your second element and A is your second last element. And in between you have D. So if you want to compare every element from the first half of your string to the second half of your string, you just need to run a for loop up till halfway the length of the string. So for I in range of 0 to find the length of the string, we have the len function to which we'll pass stg, and then we'll divide this by 2. So we are using 2 slashes because we want the integer value, not a floating point value. Now inside this we'll have an if statement to check if stg of I is not equal to stg of len of stg minus 1 minus I. So let me explain this line to you. Now stg of I will give you the element from the first half of your string. And if you subtract I from the length of the string, you'll get the ith position element but from the back of your string. So if we use the same example, that is madam, stg of I would give you M, and stg of I from the back of the string would also give you M. Now length of the string is always one more than the last index position of your string, because the indices in your string is calculated from 0 and the length is taken from 1. So the last position of your string madam would be 4, but the length of your string madam would be 5. Therefore we are subtracting 1 and I so that we get the ith position from the back of the string. I hope that's clear now. Now if these two elements are not the same, break out of the for loop, because clearly then it is not a palindrome string. And if it is the same, increment your count by 1. Now count is a variable that we need to declare outside. Now I'll tell you why we are using the count statement after this last if statement that we'll put into place. So outside your for loop, you have the if statement where you check if count is equal to half the length of the string. Now here, if your count is equal to half the length of the string, that means every iteration in for was completed. That is, I went right from 0 up to length of the string divided by 2. If count is anything lesser than this number, that means that the if statement resulted in true somewhere in between and we broke out of the for loop, because of which I could not run all the way up till the end and count was not incremented every time. So if count is equal to half the length of the string, that means that your string was a palindrome. So string was so percentile S is a palindrome, else print percentile S is not a palindrome. And there you go. So now let's run the code. This is definitely not a palindrome. Let's now try it a palindrome. So madam, and as you see, madam is a palindrome. So program's working fine. Let's recheck this. Let's try out another word, say race car. And yes, race car is also a palindrome. So with that, we also learned how to use for loops in taking care of strings. We found out if a string is a palindrome or not. So there are many other applications of for loop. You can practice a few more. And with that, we come to an end of our tutorial on for loops in Python. If you have any doubts, please post them in the comment section below and we'll definitely get back to you. If you like this video, please subscribe to our channel if you have not yet, as we have a lot more great videos coming up for you. So stay tuned and I'll see you all next time.